Yes, neither of these are in our regional pest management plan because they're new. So our resources have been focused on pathway management to minimise the spread of aquatic pests generally, but we haven't had resources specifically for these two, but nevertheless trying to work on them. And this is in a background of a number of new to New Zealand species that have been arriving over the last few years, myrtle rust being one of the notable ones, but just focusing on these two that are in the spotlight today. So Caulerpa is actually two different species of invasive seaweeds, but both look very similar. And it's known, these Caulerpa species are known to be pesty all around the world, outside of their natural ranges. And you can see there just how much that's covering over everything on the seabed. Caulerpa was first picked up in New Zealand at Aotea a couple of years ago, and there was quite an extensive population at that stage. It was already an order or two of magnitude larger than some sites overseas where there's been some success in eradication, and so it was a pretty challenging thing to have found. It was not long after found at Great Mercury Island, and then just more recently there's been now 3 extra finds, a large population up in the Bay of Islands at Te Rāwhiti, where there's perhaps 200 hectares of scattered Caulerpa, maybe more than that, but in the main area. And then a find a few weeks ago at Iris Shoal near Cabo Island, and possibly a small population there, but still scattered across quite a large area, perhaps over 30 hectares. And then just this weekend we heard about this detection at Waiheke. Not sure how big it is. The bits that we've seen are only just seem to be relatively newly established, but we might only be seeing the edge of something much bigger. We're not sure yet, so divers are out there over the next few days to check that out. And just like to point out that these are just the sites that we know about. We don't know where it's not. It could be right up the habitat is available for it right up the whole seaboard, and so it could be scattered along the coast, and we're just yet to find it in those places. Unfortunately, it does have some significant impacts. It's known to form those dense beds. It can displace native species. It spreads rapidly from fragments. We've seen it growing on scallops out in Aotea, and those scallop beds seem to have died recently. We're not sure if that's because of the Caulerpa or perhaps because of the storms that we've had, but it's concerning either way. There is research underway, funded by MPI, delivered by NEBA, to understand what the impacts of the Caulerpa might be, but that sort of thing just takes time to see how things change. An additional issue that we found at Aotea was that these vast quantities washed up after Cyclone Gabriel, 50, 100 tonnes, and it was quite a logistical exercise to clean that up because of obviously the vastness of it, but the impact on the beach, and that it also seems to have caused the conditions where Pātiki and New Zealand dotterel have ended up dying, probably through botulism as a sort of flow on from all the seaweed on the beach. So more good news, there's a freshwater gold clam. Sounds nice, it's probably not. It's been found only in the Waikato River so far. It was discovered there in May, and it's a species from Asia but established as a pest in a range of places around the world. The challenge it poses is it can form really vast populations as well, hundreds to thousands per square metre kind of thing, and they can go on and block water infrastructure, things like water treatment grills and stormwater pipes and those kinds of things. There's been problems overseas, and also an impact on the natural environment, on native species and what have you. So there's been quite a lot of early surveillance done. There's a surveillance program that MPI are leading to still look further, but they've looked in Lake Tomarata that should be Tomorata in Auckland, and not found it there, nor in other water bodies outside the Waikato River so far. So that's good news so far, and hopefully we don't find it here, but there's still a risk that it's arrived and just is undetected. So I'm going to talk a bit about our role in this, but to do that, I just want to paint a picture of, a quick picture of the biosecurity system in New Zealand. So Biosecurity New Zealand, which is a business unit of the Ministry for Primary Industries, takes a national lead on some things. That's all the pre-border and border biosecurity you'll be familiar with. They take the lead for new to New Zealand incursions. If a species hasn't been in New Zealand before, they'll investigate a new incursion and then determine whether a response is required or feasible, and they'll usually lead that new to New Zealand kind of response. Though they do also coordinate some national pest management programs like Coyote Dieback. They have a leadership role across the country. Regional councils, on the other hand, or unitary authorities like ours, are required under the Biosecurity Act to take a regional lead for biosecurity. So that typically focuses on controlling more established pests. We deal with incursions at a more regional scale, a new to region kind of incursion. And we support MPI with those new to New Zealand incursions. And we have a range of regulatory and strategic options that we capture in a regional pest management plan, which is a document that the council signs off on. DOC is involved in this, but they're chiefly responsible for land they manage, and so don't play such a big part in the kind of response that we're talking about. I'd just like to note that Auckland Council works well with MPI and DOC on these kinds of things. The interesting time is when we're in a transitional time, which we're in now with these species, where the species is now perhaps established, not just being new to New Zealand, but established as a pest. So in these cases, Biosecurity New Zealand can retain a leadership role, a national leadership role, but they're not required to, they don't have to. But regional councils and DOC and the community, mana whenua, they have to decide what role they want to take when something's becoming established. And those decisions are captured in the regional pest management plan every 10 years or so, but obviously we have to make decisions in between times. So with that background, our role in these incursions has been making sure that MPI is taking that national leadership role with our support. And so we've had staff involved in both of these responses, particularly in the Caulerpa one, which has been running a bit longer, and that it is actually in our region. So we've been on the governance and technical advisory groups and providing support to MPI, mana whenua and the community, providing some logistical support, focusing on our role in community outreach, making sure that people understand that how not to spread the pests. We call those our pathway programs, and providing input into some of the surveillance work. Yes, good. What was that on that one? Yes, oh, and another key thing, thank you. Another key element that we've been doing is pushing the Clean Hull plan as a national plan that we've previously talked to the council about to try and reduce the risk of spread of marine pests through national legislation. And so we've been taking a leadership role in advocating for that legislation. In terms of next steps for both of these incursions, we'd like to note that just eradication tools for anything under the water are really limited and often experimental. So that makes it quite challenging. The species that we're dealing with are really difficult to prevent the spread of. They spread from fragments, or in the case of the clams, with larvae, which can just spread around on currents or on anchors, as we've heard, or in recreational equipment. For example, boats going from Caulerpa to Lake Pupuki in Auckland is a really high-risk pathway. Bringing just wet gear and water is the sort of way that clam can spread. So we're looking to increase our focus on that pathway management, try to intervene to stop it, reduce the amount of spread. MPI are planning some removal trials for Caulerpa. So they'll be trialling suction dredging, hand pulling and chlorine pellets. And we heard earlier today that Ngāti Manahiri are directly involved in the hand pulling out at Iris Shoal at Kawa. And there'll be some more surveillance and delimitation underway. Beyond that, I just wanted to focus a bit more in on our next steps and some of the actions. So we've been looking at what Auckland Council's role should be, and we're intending to increase our marine biosecurity efforts. This year we're looking to do some reprioritisation within NETA as a one-off while we're working out what the scale of this problem is. That's equivalent of about doubling this year's OPEX budget, so not including staff time, but doubling our OPEX budget about $250,000 more. And that's not funded in the long term, but something we can do for this year. We'll focus on that pathway management, support ambassador programs. We're trialling some towed cameras for surveillance this week, and we'll use our remote underwater vehicle as well for that. And just continuing to support mana whenua and MPI and our input into things like the governance and advisory groups. And just noting that there's been a pretty clear message to us from the Minister of Biosecurity and from MPI and from the community that regional councils really need to step up their investment in this as part of a partnership approach now that the scale of the issues are getting larger. And so we're acknowledging that, and this is part of our effort towards that. And we're happy, of course, to take any questions.
Kia ora. Thank you both for that rather bleak presentation. It is an extreme concern, especially to our Gulf Islands, but I know that everyone who cares for us, kaitiaki for our Gulf, but also just our marine life right around Tamaki Makaurau and the North Island as it looks. Councillor Fletcher has the first question.
Phil, Rachel, thank you so much for the comprehensive overview. This goes beyond just sort of a bit of a nuisance into something that will be hectares and hectares. Can you give us a better understanding on what that does to Kina, what it does to our whole marine ecosystem, what potentially that might flow on to in terms of economic consequences? I don't think that there is a comprehensive awareness yet of what this could do in terms of devastating our food source and our economy.
Oh, you want more bleak?
Yeah, I want bleak.
Thanks, Councillor Fletcher. You're right, it's a really big challenge. It's known overseas in the Mediterranean, for example, the Caulerpa there has extended over thousands of hectares. It's been associated with a 50% drop in fish species in those areas. I mentioned about the scallops here, the tipa, definitely concerned about that. A real simplification of ecosystems, so where currently we might have kelp forests and things, eventually Caulerpa can just become a monoculture, and it's a bit like kikuyu, it grows on the surface but also under the surface, and so it has the ability to change the sediment and basically just, it'll create lawns that may well impact on many of our species. It's too early to say exactly how bad it'll be or exactly what the implications are, but certainly looking around the world, where it's established, it's very worrying.
So I wonder if you are aware that the co-chairs with the executive officer of the Hauraki Gulf Forum went to Wellington last week to meet with Damien O'Connor to try and highlight the national significance of this. And his question was to the Hauraki Gulf Forum is what's Auckland Council's thinking? So they're obviously thinking about us taking a leadership role on it. And I think, what do you feel we need to do by way of showing, hopefully, unanimous support for some actions that Wellington might be taking? So it's really important to me, but I'm curious from an officer perspective how important it is that we can go beyond just tabling this report today, which I think is quite an inadequate response given the gravity of the situation.
Through the chair, and thank you for that, I guess, question and challenge, Councillor Fletcher. You're right, I mean, it is a significant issue, and I think the approach that we've taken to date has been to let the respective roles of MPI leading a New Zealand response with our support in the first instance. We have been involved in the response at Aotea right from the outset, in both the capacity of supporting on the ground work but also the technical advisory work. I think one of the challenges with this species is that we don't have comparable examples overseas where there's been successful eradication of infestations of the nature that we have here on around the parts of New Zealand where it's been found, although noting that in some places it is more sparse, and that might be something that we are able to achieve. This is a top of the North Island wide issue, so I think it's appropriate that that leadership comes from central government, but as Phil mentioned, we play an important role in that regional biosecurity space, and so we are looking to reprioritise some of our targeted rate investment to support the response activities, including additional staff capacity, but also on the ground support. We did stand up an ambassador program last year in partnership with Mana Whenua on Aotea to help with the outreach program, and we're looking at other physical ways we can support the current response at various locations, so surveillance, tow cameras, lending some of our marine expertise, but we're mindful that you know, this is a national issue, and we need to work within that national system.
So what can we take from what is happening in Northland, because it will just be devastating for Northland, and I know that one of our former colleagues, Jack Crawer, is based and involved in that. Is the leadership coming from these other councils?
Each of the councils have a slightly different set of skills, I think, in response to marine biosecurity. So Northland and Bay of Plenty have their own dive expertise, in-house dive expertise. We don't have that here in Auckland Council. So I know that they're heavily involved in supporting MPI, working with MPI to get into the water, literally, physically. MPI is looking to run similar trials in Auckland region, which we're supporting, which will be comparable to what's happening in Northland, to look at some of those options around different removal tools that could be used in certain situations. So that's currently underway. We're supporting that. We're not supporting it in the same way in that we don't have the dive expertise, but we are supporting that work to happen.
Given the devastating consequences that could flow out of this, do you feel the recommendations that are being put up now are sufficient to meet the concerns and the resources that you're going to require?
I think it's fair to say that as our response collectively to this, to both of these incursions becomes more well understood and shaped up, that there is a strong likelihood that additional resourcing will be required, and we've captured that, I think, in recommendation C, which is that we will need to look to that, but at this point in time we are reprioritising within our current resourcing levels, and we will need, I think, to flex if more information comes to hand that suggests there are different ways to approach this problem.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you. Deputy Chair Dalton.
Thank you for the update. I was just thinking while you were speaking to us, Phil, you mentioned clean hulls and the importance of clean hulls. And we've had this discussion earlier around hard stands in another forum. And I think the advice you received was that it's not council's role to provide the hard stands themselves. We have a policy, or I don't know if it's a policy, to deal with that. But actually, in light of what is happening here and what we're facing, would it be more responsible for us not to reduce the number of hard stands that are around, particularly into the Hauraki Gulf?
Through the chair, I'm happy to pick that one up. I guess one of so absolutely the cleaning of hulls is an important part of our biosecurity management system, but in this particular instance, the way that Caulerpa spread is not so much a hull issue, but an anchor, a chain, a current disturbance pathway. So I guess if we're going to take any good news out of some of the information we've just shared, is that that side of things is not so much going to influence the outcome from a Caulerpa perspective. Likewise with the gold clam, more likely to come in on, well, it's a freshwater pest, so it's coming in through different channels, not through those marine channels. But of course, the cleaning of hulls is important, and we're looking at that provision of, there are commercial services that provide the facilities for that work to be done. We know that at different times of year they can be under pressure, but in this instance it's not so much of a consideration for these particular species.
But perhaps for any in the future that might be transported by hulls. Thank you, Rachel.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you. Councillor Darby.
Thanks, both. So we're dealing with both of the species. What is it? The Racapus and the Parvafolia. They're similar. They're both present, are they?
That's right. They're visually almost indistinguishable, just genetically distinct. So we're just calling them exotic Caulerpas.
So the origin naturally is the Indo-Pacific area. So the pathway, is it more likely to be international shipping, or is it recreational craft that are coming back from their Fijian trip or whatever? What's known right now is the likely pathway?
There's two key theories. The initial theory was that it had come across on an anchor from, probably from Australia or something, people sailing to New Zealand, and then although they're required to actually go straight into port, perhaps anchoring over at Aotea, in this case, and potentially dropping off the anchor there. So that's possible. It is acknowledged though that Caulerpas are often used in aquariums, and it's possible that a super yacht has got an aquarium, or some sort of vessel, maybe a cruise ship, has got an aquarium, and in cleaning the aquarium, fragments of Caulerpa have escaped, have been washed overboard, and it may have established that way. So, of course, we'll never know how these individual ones got in, but those are the two sort of key pathways we're concerned about.
So it's not an aquarium plant that you can buy in New Zealand for a saltwater aquarium. Okay.
Not in New Zealand.
So just going to the pathway, Councillor Dalton has sort of raised that the pathway of recreational craft. So it's not something that adheres to a hull. It's probably something that's caught on something. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And so anchors are key concern. Fishing gear, scallop dredges, fishing trawls, anything that drags through the water and then is moved along, it can pick up fragments.
Right. So even on yeah, okay. So what checks are in place for international shipping coming in? All the shipping that comes into the Port of Auckland is a customer of the Port of Auckland, which is our company, 100% owned by us. So what sort of checks does the port company undertake of shipping on a random basis? Underwater hull checks. Now they're pretty they're pretty demanding, those sorts of checks. But this is sort of the thin end of the wedge. We're likely to be getting a lot more, and the environmental conditions are more conducive to species surviving. So, can you just tell us about what other checks are in place? For example, the Port of Auckland. And then the other question, I'll leave it there, Chair, is MPI are suggesting there needs to be greater investment in the partnership approach. But is not MPI the primary responsible body because of the national impact? And I'm pretty keen to know that they are resourced and asking their ministers for more investment before they actually say, hey, it's partnership and we need to co-invest. A couple of questions there.
Thanks, Councillor. that international shipping is managed by MPI, and so they have some clear standards that ships are required on entry to New Zealand about things like how clean their hull is and what they do with their ballast water, among other things. And I couldn't tell you for sure what their random checking regime is, but we understand it to be reasonably thorough. So, you can never check 100% of the things, but it is reasonably thorough, and they do take action when they find problems. So it's not directly the responsibility of the port, and I'm not sure if they also take further action themselves, but it would be primarily the responsibility of MPI. As to who's again primarily responsible, yes, would argue that the Ministry for Primary Industries should still be taking a national lead because of the potential scale of the impact and the fact that it's likely, that it could spread quite a lot further down our coast. But as with a number of other national, those transitional times as things establish, things like wallabies are an established pest. MPI is taking a national lead because there needs to be some national leadership, but regional councils are also investing. And so it's just a little bit about what's that ratio. I think they felt that they were resource constrained when the Aotea situation first arose. Of course, they're dealing with a long list of new to New Zealand incursions, and they have to work out which ones they think they can invest in and succeed in. The advice they were getting was that it would be very difficult to succeed with Caulerpa. And so while they were operating, they did spend a reasonable amount of money on it while it was just known to be at Aotea and then Ahuahu, Great Mercury. It's only been when the Bay of Islands population has been found that I think it feels a bit like the budgetary shackles have been removed. But to be clear about what the resource requirements would be for, we hear talk of elimination and eradication, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe far more than that even, would be required, and to invent tools that we don't have yet.
Just one quickie, Chair. How far does a vessel have to be out? Like I'm talking about international freight here. How far does it have to be out before it can flush a tank out? Is it 12 nautical miles, or is it something more?
Yeah, there's a couple of different zones out there. It is beyond 12 nautical miles. It may even be beyond the next. There's an exclusive economic zone. I forget the name of that one, but yeah.
Okay, detail. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you. Councillor Turner.
Oh, sorry. I was just thinking about what naturally keeps this stuff in check. Is it what manatees munch on or something?
Yes, there is a slug, not nearly as exciting as manatees. Overseas, there are slugs that do eat it. We have talked about manatees and those diving iguanas from the Galapagos. We think that'd be quite cool to introduce as a control, but probably not practical. Actually, on that though, there is a toxin in these Caulerpas, and so a lot of species won't eat it. And that slug actually ends up absorbing it and then is not palatable to fish. So there's something in there around the toxicity of Caulerpas. It's not the one we have here is not highly toxic. There are more toxic ones, but there's still the toxin.
But it doesn't smother in its natural habitat?
Not to the same extent, no. We have native Caulerpa here that live in harmony. But outside of their natural range, it's quite possible that they'd be bad as well.
But they don't live in natural harmony with this stuff, right? It overwhelms them. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor Lee. Just your mic, please, Mike.
In terms of its impact on the marine ecology, what data do we have? We know that it's expanding, that it's been present on Aotea for several years. It's in Rāwhiti in the Bay of Islands. It's apparently off Waiheke, though I haven't been told exactly where, but in terms of its ecological impact, and I make the point that our native kelp beds, Eclonia, Carpophyllum, rocky reefs are badly depleted, so-called kinnibarrons, indirectly because of human impacts. Now, is this incursion, is it spreading onto the habitat, which would normally be preferred by native kelps, or is it spreading in other areas, mud, sand and so on? Because that's quite important, I think.
Yes, thanks, councillor. At Aotea, where it's been established for some time, and particularly in Okupu Blind Bay, where it's well established, it's present from pretty much the low tide mark down to 38 metres, and it is right across sandbeds and all over cobbles and boulders. So it is, and it's forming kind of 95% cover in those areas. So it is, yeah. So it's just a solid meadow, not across the entire bay, hope yet, but certainly across large areas, like we're talking about hectares and hectares of just 95% cover. And so it is very much going over the habitat of some of those other species, and it has an extraordinary broad range. Not many species can live from low tide all the way down to that kind of depth, and possibly deeper.
So its preferences are pretty broad in terms of substrate, so rocky reefs and mudflats and so on.
It seems to be, yes. And NIWA are doing some work on behalf of MPI looking at the likely ecological impacts. So they've set up some permanent transects in a range of places at Aotea. And they've got there's a report on their initial observations, but they obviously need to be going back to see the change.
So obviously, negative impacts. Are there any positive impacts?
At this point in time, we're not seeing positive impacts, but as Phil said, there's still work to be done to understand the full extent of impacts. I think just a couple of other things to note is the Irish shoal location wouldn't have typically been what would have been thought to be ideal habitat for it, being slightly more current prone. And at this point in time, it's not thought that the west coast would be suitable habitat for it, so it is an eastern seaboard issue as best as we know. But I think the challenge for us is that there's still a lot to learn, and in terms of just the, I guess the comment about spread is the hard thing about these marine and freshwater pest species is that you don't know what you can't see. And so we've found this, these incursions off Aotea, but they could be a lot more widespread than we know. And it may not be so much that they're spreading, but that they're already established and we haven't picked them up. So one of the pieces of work that's happening is going to be that region-wide surveillance of high-risk sites or potentially high-risk sites.
I know we're looking at a range of control measures, and I think the Northland Regional Council is going for a local eradication, but the track record of dealing with marine pests, marine algal pests, is not particularly good, and obviously it's extremely difficult to eradicate or even control. Do we have examples of other incursions internationally where this thing has come in, impacted on a local ecosystem, and do we have any information on that to plot the trajectory of this incursion? Because sometimes you get an explosion, an eruption if you like, and then you get some sort of balance and equilibrium, because we've had many marine algal pests before, haven't we?
Yes, that's right, and we do rather hope that we're seeing an eruption that will fall away again. But experience overseas, I'm not the expert on this, but been talking to the technical advisory group, and there are some examples where Caulerpas have been eliminated, but we're talking about sites that are up to about 1 hectare. And so at Aotea, just in one bay, we have between 40 and 80 hectares. At Rāwhiti, perhaps 200 hectares. So elimination will be extremely challenging and orders of magnitude bigger than what's been achieved overseas.
Yeah, but I think it's vital that we get as much data as possible on this Caulerpa, and mysteriously there's 2 species arrived virtually at the same time, which is also, I don't know if that's happened overseas as well, and that's most peculiar, but it's important that we get good data on it, and especially its impacts on the marine ecosystem, in particular on whether it's impacting on native kelp species and displacing them, or whether it's preferentially going for open areas. That would be really helpful to know, wouldn't it? Because, yeah, okay.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Leone.
Just a couple of questions around the diving team. So with the diving team at the moment, who's part of that group?
So Auckland Council don't have a diving team themselves. We have people who could be part of a diving team, but we don't manage a diving team. So the people who are diving at the moment are principally NIWA scientists on behalf of MPI. Sometimes some of the other research institutes will be helping too. And then the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, who we actually contract to do quite a bit of our diving work, and the Northern Regional Council, who have their own dive teams.
Are we looking at developing our own in the future, given, that it's likely that these are going to be coming up a lot more in the future?
Marine biosecurity is quite a new thing for us, for the country really. And so each council puts a different level of emphasis on how they have the balance between terrestrial kind of biosecurity stuff on the land and stuff in the sea. We've been focused on our pathway management, so we're making sure that boat hulls are clean and all that kind of thing. But as we are getting to understand the marine biosecurity system better in Auckland, then we're considering, what does our marine biosecurity team need to look like? So we don't have an immediate plan for a dive team, but it's always been in the back of our heads that might be a development as we establish our program better.
Yeah, the reason why I was raising it is just because I know that the Waiheke Marine Project do actually have a team of divers already. So I think there's existing resources within the community organisations that we could be partnering with to continue to have regular or better monitoring systems. So it was just a suggestion.
Yes, that's a good point. I did overlook mentioning them. The Waiheke Marine Project have recreational divers. We couldn't contract them. They wouldn't probably meet the commercial requirements that council would have for health and safety. But that doesn't mean that we can't support their mahi in different ways.
Kia ora, thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Just a supplementary to an earlier question. Have you approached the aquaculture industry, who are going to be potentially impacted by this greatly, to give some support? Or that maybe that's been done through Damien O'Connor's office, but how active are the aquaculture industry in supporting the research that's taking place and hopefully any remedial action?
Good question. You're right, it is being led by the Ministry of Primary Industries. I haven't seen a significant engagement, but it might be just happening behind the scenes. I think the mussel farmers aren't particularly concerned. It doesn't tend to climb, although we've seen a little bit of evidence of climbing at Aotea, but perhaps oyster farmers might be concerned. So actually that's a good thing. I might go back and check on, but I haven't heard of a great deal of engagement.
If you want to give me some feedback on that separate to this, that'd be great.
Thanks, Councillor. Last question, Councillor Lee.
Just a final question, in terms of dealing with this, is it known whether Evie or Kina will graze it as it grazes native kelp? If so, that may be helpful.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. And so there have been some lab trials going on for choice trials for Kina. Will it eat Caulerpa or will it eat preferentially all the native species? That's just being that research is being finished. Meanwhile, out on Aotea, some locals are just giving it a good old Kiwi try, and they're doing some of their own cage trials on having Kina inside areas, like inside a cage where there is extensive Caulerpa. We know that Kina will eat it, but we're interested to see how much of it will they eat, will they die, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's a little bit of looking into that. Very interesting. Thank you for that.
Kia ora, thanks, Mike. Sorry, Councillor Lee. I didn't mean to call you Mike. There's a very good point around the Kina and the issues we're having on the other side with the Kina barons, and if there was a way to, cross-pollinate the problems we're having. I guess one last question from me. So is the assumption that there does seem to be a little bit of discussion around that it may have always been entering our waters, but the temperature change in the water has made it take hold and sort of replicate?
I think, through the chair, I think there's a range of working theories about how it's come into the country and for how long, including, what was the initial where did it start? I think, there's some different thoughts around that, and we really just don't know the answer to that at that time. I mean, that is a possibility. And, one of the concerns, of course, and we heard it earlier, was that as we have a warming climate, we are likely to see both in the terrestrial and aquatic space an increase in new incursions, or even established species going outside of their normal ranges, their normal sort of historic range. So that's something that we're certainly thinking about and are mindful will be of greater likelihood as we move into those warmer temperatures.
I understand you're both and the team's doing quite a bit of work with MPI on this. Is there anything that we need to be asking for or securing budget for urgently, or do you feel like at the moment you're doing, there's nothing governance-wise we need to do to enable you to do more than you could be doing, I guess? I'm just making sure that we're giving you all the tools that you have.
Not at this immediate point in time, but if things were to change, that might be a conversation that we need to have. As Phil mentioned, and I think I covered off as well, we are doing some reprioritisation within our existing natural environment targeted rate program, which we can sustain for this current year, but it wouldn't be an ongoing solution because it would ultimately compromise other work that we have committed to doing. But at the moment, we're able to make that work, and we're looking at how we stand up that response. But very much working alongside MPI to understand the needs of the program as more information comes to hand.
So if you would be able to come to us, say at a committee meeting before the 10-year budget, because we have discussed previously that this needs to be put into the 10-year budget, this type of work, but you could come to us for a change in budget or a request for budget if there was an urgent partnership fund or something that we needed to do.
Thank you, yes.
Okay.
If that was the case, we could do that, yes.
Good. Thank you.
Chair, I wonder whether, given the importance of this issue, that perhaps the lead officer could include in our monthly meetings an update so that we are kept abreast of it, and if there is further intervention required by us, that can happen more seamlessly.
Yes, I think that, definitely. So the memo received last month, I think we can add to that, broaden that scope, and make sure we're looping in the local boards and mana whenua who are doing the work right now, and push that out to everyone as well. So thank you. Right, we have 3 resolutions up here moved by myself and Councillor Dalton. Don't know if there's any debate here at this time. Right. All those in favour? Aye. Any opposed? Thank you very much. Thank you. Right, don't know if we need a precedent of business. We're just going to choose to move item 15 forward. So Chair Phil James doesn't have to stay the whole meeting, although it seems she's enjoying herself.